Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. We've all heard of the serial killers, Boston Strangler, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Gacy, Hannibal Lecter, and admittedly, there's a certain amount of fascination that we harbor with these characters. Why? Is there some part of us that identifies with these characters, at least in a little way, albeit not to the full extent? This is called sadomasochism. Today, we'll be speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center and an expert in all things psychological. I'm Pat Kazakoff. Stay with me. Hello, Dr. Hamm.
Good morning, Pat. How are you?
So I mentioned that, well, is it true? Do we identify a little bit with these characters?
I think so, whether we'd like to admit it or not. I think that characters meaning serial killers, sadists, I think there's a little bit of that in all of us. Not that we're serial killers or sadists by any means necessarily, we would hope, not all of us anyway. But yeah, there is, I think, a bit of us there that we can relate to. I think sadists are misunderstood people in this respect that is awful and abhorrent as they are, and they truly are, of course. They evidently have some capacity for empathy, to be able to feel the pain of their victims. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sadists. I mean, there is a motivation there that drives them to inflict pain and suffering. So there's something in them that wants to create that I guess reflects an emotion that they can imagine that their victims have, that they can relate to. So there is.
What percentage of people have this? Because we're talking about the extreme here. When we're talking about the Boston Strangler or Jeffrey Dahmer, what percentage of people have this? It can't be a lot.
Serial killers themselves?
Well, I'm talking about somebody that you would diagnose as sadomasochistic.
It's very, I'd say probably no more than 1%. I don't know what the statistics are. Someone who meets the criteria, first of all, sadistic personality disorder never made it as an official classified personality disorder. It was proposed, and it has been talked about for many decades in psychology. So I don't know if there's any statistics on it because it really doesn't exist from an official standpoint. But I would estimate probably about maybe 1% that meet the criteria. Now that's not the same as a serial killer, of course, you understand, even though a sadistic personality disorder is someone who is quite disturbed.
So let's just talk about, like, very basically, what exactly how would you define being sadistic? Like what's the definition, the simple definition for people who are listening to our show?
Well, this this concept, I think everyone knows this, came from the Marquis de Sade, who was this infamous author during the French Revolution in the 18th century, and he wrote these stories about various kinds of sort of depraved and very atypical, to say the least, sexual acts while he was incarcerated. And a psychiatrist by the name of Richard Kraft-Ebing from Germany wrote a book on sexual disorders. And so he's the one that adopted Sod's name to refer to this practice of inflicting pain on others sexually.
So this business of being sadistic, simply put, is it like taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune? Because I think we can all identify with that on some level, or am I being a little too simplistic?
Yeah, I see it. I think the literature doesn't really talk about it as a spectrum, but I see it as spectrum. Um, yeah, that's the part in us that we can relate to. Even someone who is as abject as a serial killer. So there's this German term many people have heard of. It's called Schadenfreude, which it's an emotion for a feeling or taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. So that's a very, very, very mild form of sadism, because sadism is by definition taking pleasure in someone's suffering and pain.
So we all have a little bit of that in us? I mean, someone gets a better job or a better mark than us. I mean, isn't that pretty common to have those kinds of emotions? Sometimes we call it jealousy.
Well, it's related to envy, and jealousy could be, but Schadenfreude more specifically is a reaction to something happening to someone else. That's a misfortune, and feeling pleasure in that. So that's closer to, in my opinion, sadism, because that's what sadism is about. Only it's at a very, as I say, very, very mild level. We're not going out there and being violent. We're not controlling. We're not taking an interest in weapons and heinous crimes. We're not humiliating people. We're just feeling something.
And what is that feeling exactly? Like, how does it, on this mild level that you're talking about, like, do you get exhilarated, or what's the feeling?
You speak as though you've never experienced it.
No, no, I've experienced it, but I just want to know, for people, like when they feel it, people are watching this, like what kind of emotion how can they identify that this, to themselves, that this is a sadistic pleasure? Like, do they get happy? Do they get exhilarated?
Yeah, I wouldn't really call it a sadistic pleasure per se. I mean, it's on a spectrum, in my opinion, a very mild form of sadism. But it's like when you're happy, someone, a villain, someone you don't like, someone who's a bad person, and you find that they get their comeuppance, as the expression goes. So bad karma, karma. It's a term that I know Bill Maher hates his program, but when you find someone who's reached some kind of misfortune that you feel deserves it, or you can't stand them, or they're a bad person, you feel pleasure. Well, they got their just desserts, that kind of thing. But it could come out of envy, as you're saying, a derivative of that. So there's a mild form of the pleasure that we feel in someone else's pain. And that's what a sadist is, but on steroids, so to speak, where the emotions are ramped up. And if it takes the form of a serial killer, let's say, I mean, some of these infamous guys, I was just reading about Robert, Verdilla, the butcher of Kansas City, and the things that they did is just unconscionable. So there's a very good movie that came out many years ago called Seven, with Brad Pitt.
Kevin Lacey, Kevin Spacey.
Kevin Spacey, yeah, about a serial killer who tortured all his victims. Which, when I saw the movie, I thought this has got to be made up stuff, but it's not. it's taken from these case histories that these guys are really bad. They do these things. But not all sadists are serial killers, but a sadistic personality is someone who enjoys humiliating, and usually not physical, it's emotional or verbal. Um, so you might know some people, you know, in public or that we're familiar with in the news who are like this. I think the mean-spiritedness that exists will suggest a kind of sadistic quality in
Do
public
people,
life.
do patients come to you and identify this quality in themselves and it's causing them trouble? Or they have trouble and you identify this sadistic tendency in them? How does that work?
Uh, it's more the latter. Someone with a sadistic personality disorder rarely comes into therapy wanting to be a better person. Um, they don't usually see anything wrong with themselves. Um, there's, I think, something that's rewarding about it. You know, it's the consequences of that behavior that often lead to a patient who, with this disorder, to come to a therapist either through law enforcement or by families, and then they learn about it, you know, indirectly. And even then, it's difficult to treat because it's difficult for a person with this disorder to own, you know, the destructiveness of the behaviors.
You just mentioned law enforcement, and so it twigged a thought in my mind. Are there certain professions or places that people who have this nature are attracted to?
Yes, that's a very good question. So people who like to be in control or they seek power, whether it's in government or the military or law enforcement, any kind of position of authority uh, attracts these kinds of people, unfortunately. So, you know, we hear a lot about abuse, you know, by the police. And while there are many good police officers, it does exist because that profession does attract these kinds of characters. And then you have abuse.
Right. I'm just thinking if you take this to the general theme, there's a lot of professions in the world, not just professions, but jobs where people have authority.
Yes, anyone with authority then has the capability. It gives them the privilege, if you will, to exercise whatever badness in them, you know, exists. Um, so, you know, you might. It's not unusual to hear, you know, someone who has a boss who's a micromanager, for example. That doesn't mean they're a sadist,
Mhm.
but that would be an example of how someone in a position of authority can abuse their power in a sadistic way if this is an issue that they have.
You also mentioned that Richard von Krafft-Ebing was the first who introduced the concept of sadomasochism. He introduced it in the 19th century. It seems to be rather late to me. Why did it come into being so late? Why was it identified so late?
Well, I think it's not because it's a fairly new phenomenon, but science and medicine are fairly new in our civilization. Um, so, you know, psychiatry, Krafft-Ebing was a psychiatrist, um, got its start in the 19th century. I mean, prior to that, they called them alienists, but really, medicine really had not come into its own as a profession as we know it today, with all the specialty areas in modern medicine, you know, until the past couple of centuries. That's why.
So
So it's not a new phenomenon.
got it, but it's
Yeah.
identified it's been recently identified, and perhaps I could use the word categorized.
Yeah, the American Psychiatric Association back in the 1980s, in the DSM-3R revision, incorporated a few personality disorders, including masochistic, which we discussed in another show, personality, and sadist, passive aggressive. They call them these investigative or research categories because there wasn't enough evidence to support statistically whether these emerge as separate, and they were not adopted eventually. But that's when it was first codified. But people since Freud, scientists and psychologists have been writing about this, since the beginning of modern science and psychiatry.
Right. That's what I would have assumed.
Yeah.
So what exactly defines the sadistic personality?
Probably the most outstanding feature is the need to humiliate other people. Especially, humiliation is a behavior that occurs in the presence often of other people. So it often does occur when in public. And it's usually not physical, it can be. Some people can be very intimidating physically and threatened in that way, but mostly it's verbal humiliation, such as your boss is displeased with you and he reams you out in front of your coworkers. If this is something that occurs repeatedly, we would suspect that this person has sadistic personality traits. So humiliating others, taking an interest in weapons, in heinous crimes or serial killers, someone who likes to control others, doesn't allow people to, say, a spouse who doesn't allow their partner any autonomy. These kinds of features. What else? Anything I'm missing there?
Well, what's important here is to diagnose a sadistic personality. What criteria are used to make that diagnosis?
Yeah, those are the ones in finding pleasure in witnessing someone inflicting pain or someone in pain, including animals. So this was codified by the American Psychiatric Association in the 1980s, and there were 8 criteria altogether. If you met 4 of them, then you were considered to be diagnostically a sadistic personality disorder.
And what would the 8 be? I want to make sure that I don't fall into any classification.
Well, again, this never got adopted, but using physical cruelty and violence to establish dominance, humiliating people in the presence of others, exhibiting unusually harsh treatment toward others under their control, amusement or witnessing pain in others, including animals, lying in order to inflict pain, using intimidation or terror to elicit compliance, restricting autonomy of people that they are close to, and finally exhibiting fascination with violence and torture. Those are the 8 altogether.
Right, and if you exhibit 4 of them, you're diagnosed as sadistic personality.
But again, it never was adopted, so it's not a personality disorder per se. Not everyone agrees with that. So the personologist, Theodore Milan, who is an expert in personality disorders, holds that it still has enough salience to it to warrant a separate category. It's interesting, a differential diagnosis from antisocial personality disorder, which was related to it, and narcissistic personality disorder is, as I was saying earlier in our show today, that people who are narcissistic or sociopathic are less inclined to be able to empathize with their victims.
Except you mentioned at the beginning of the show that these people, the sadomasochists, the serial killers, they have a capacity for empathy. In fact, that's part of their, that's part of why they do this. They can feel it. It differentiates them.
And that's why I think that there's a dynamic in everyone who has a severe, or even severe, or not severe, but is diagnosable as a sadistic personality, has some kind of trauma in their history that they can relate to because they have been subjected to those kinds of awful feelings.
So is this would you say this was hereditary, or would you say this is learned behavior, or once again, combination?
I think everything about us, all creatures, are a combination, nature, nurture. The research, by and large, demonstrates across the board, whether it's a medical or physical trait, or even personality trait or a mental disorder, that roughly speaking, the nature nurture falls into a 50-50 split. But that's an oversimplification. So with regard to the antisocial personality, you probably have certain temperamental characteristics that they may be so-called born with, such as an irritability, an impulsivity, or a dominant kind of personality. But I think that so many people fit those categories. They're not sadists or serial killers by any means. I think that on top of that, there are learned experiences, either growing up in an environment where you witness a lot of abuse, taking pleasure in that. But I think more importantly, someone has been subjected repeatedly or traumatized, assaulted. And this is a way of subconsciously working through trauma by a role reversal, so that one becomes the persecutor and victimizes another. And one identifies with their victim and subjects someone else to an experience that they once themselves had. And subconsciously, it's an effort to overcome, but it never does transform this disorder. It never assuages the trauma,
The pain.
pain.
So what about the treatment? What's the treatment for this, if there is any?
Well, it's like any kind of personality disorder, they're very difficult to treat, and especially in the category of cluster B, it's called, which are the dramatic types, such as narcissist or antisocial, or even sadist. Psychotherapy, usually many years, to learn to develop an understanding about how your behavior affects others, and to work through whatever trauma is underlying this condition.
I have to say, Dr. Hamm, this was a little bit out of the box, this topic. It's not a common topic, and it's not something that we've talked about. But I see how it relates, how you're relating it to narcissism and to other. There seems to be a cluster of problems. When one person has one, it's hard to diagnose because it seems to go all over the place.
That's the reason why it never really emerged as a separate disorder. Statistically, they cannot tease out, because there's so much overlap between these antisocial, narcissist, and especially antisocial and sadistic personality. But there is a qualitative difference, because the sadist, again, enjoys humiliation and takes pleasure in someone else's misfortune.
That's the empathy part of it. That's the distinguishing factor.
Yes, it's a twisted kind of empathy because it's inflicting pain on someone else, uh, presumably because there is this subconscious effort to sort of turn the table on a dynamic in order to transform it.
Well, as always, it's been overly interesting for me. I'm always interested, and I can't wait for the next topic. And anything else you want to say in closing that we haven't talked about?
No, I mean it's serial killers are very rare, of course, but they are at the forefront often in the media because they're exciting. It's very dramatic. But they do exist. It's not in the movies. There are some people who are this disturbed, but many people who are sadistic personalities are not serial killers. I mean, this does exist in society, even though to a small percentage of the population.
Well, thank you very much once again, Dr. Hamm, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month with, I'm sure, as exciting a topic as this one, and also unusual. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
My pleasure.
Bye.